She'll be remembered as a country music legend, but Dolly Parton, who has died aged 80, was much more than that. She was an artist and a humanitarian.
She spent 80 years turning a hard childhood into a legend, and now the world is watching her final words back with completely different eyes. Dolly Parton is gone, and the interview she gave only days before her death is breaking hearts all over again, because at the time, not a single person watching knew they were hearing her say goodbye. Nobody in that room, not the crew, not the fans, not even Dolly herself, treated it like a farewell. It was just another conversation, warm and funny and full of plans for what came next. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you will understand why those last few minutes of footage feel so different now, and why so many people cannot stop replaying them, searching for some sign they missed the first time around. Let's start at the very beginning, in a place most of the world never would have heard of if it hadn't produced her. Dolly Rebecca Parton came into the world on January 19, 1946, in the hills of Sevier County, Tennessee, right in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains. She was the fourth of 12 children born to Robert Lee Parton and Ovie Lee Parton, and there was nothing glamorous about how they lived. The family's home was a tiny one-room cabin near Locust Ridge, the kind of place where privacy simply didn't exist and where every dollar had to stretch further than it should have. 12 children under one roof meant that beds were shared, meals were stretched thin, and new clothes were a luxury the family rarely had. Dolly would talk about that cabin for the rest of her life, sometimes with humor, sometimes with real tenderness, but she never pretended it had been easy. Money was scarce. Space was scarcer. And yet somehow that cramped little cabin produced one of the most joyful entertainers America has ever seen. What that home lacked in comfort, it made up for in sound. Ovie Lee sang constantly, not for an audience, but because singing was simply how she moved through her day, whether she was cooking, cleaning, or rocking a baby to sleep. Old mountain ballads, gospel hymns, songs passed down through generations with no sheet music at all, just memory and love. There was no radio playing in the background half the time, just her mother's voice filling the cabin, and that became the soundtrack of Dolly's earliest years. Her father wasn't a musician, but he understood, in his own quiet way, that his daughter had something rare, and he never stood in the way of it. Dolly soaked all of it in. While her father worked whatever jobs he could find to keep the family fed, her mother was quietly handing her daughter the one thing that would eventually take her out of that cabin altogether, a deep, instinctive understanding of melody and story. Dolly wasn't content just to listen, though. From a very young age she was already writing her own songs, putting words to feelings she was still too young to fully understand, and she got her first guitar as a child and never really put it down again. While most kids her age were figuring out what they wanted to be when they grew up, Dolly already knew. She wanted to write songs. She wanted to sing them herself. And she wanted an audience far bigger than the one sitting around her family's supper table. Friends and relatives who watched her perform in those early years often said the same thing. She didn't perform like a child playing dress-up. She performed like someone who already knew exactly where she was headed. It didn't take long for people outside Locust Ridge to notice her. She started performing on local radio and television while she was still just a girl, building the kind of stage instincts you usually can't teach. Her uncle, Bill Owens, became one of the first adults to take her talent seriously as something more than a hobby. He wrote songs with her, opened doors for her, and helped her make the kinds of connections a teenager from rural Tennessee normally never got close to. He would drive her to shows, introduce her to people in the business, and stand just off to the side of the stage while she performed, close enough to catch her if anything went wrong, far enough to let her shine on her own. By her teenage years, Dolly was traveling for performances and even appearing on national television, experiences that most young singers could only dream about. She was, by every account, already living a version of the dream long before most people her age had even decided what they wanted from life. But everyone in the country music world knew where the real opportunities were, and it wasn't Sevier County. It was Nashville. The moment Dolly graduated from Sevier County High School in 1964, she packed up and left for Music City, still a teenager, with no guaranteed record deal and no safety net. She simply believed, with total conviction, that staying home and wondering what if would have been worse than failing on her own terms. It's easy, looking back from where her career ended up, to treat that decision as inevitable. It wasn't. She was an 18-year-old girl from a one-room cabin, walking into one of the most competitive, unforgiving industries in the country, with nothing but a suitcase, a guitar, and a stubborn belief in herself. Nashville chewed up plenty of hopeful singers who arrived with less determination than Dolly had. At first, Her breakthrough didn't come from her own voice at all, it came from her pen. She had been writing songs since childhood, and once she got into rooms with the right producers and artists, those songs started finding homes. One of her earliest wins was Put It Off Until Tomorrow, a song she co-wrote that became a hit for singer Bill Phillips, with Dolly herself singing backing vocals. It was a small taste of something enormous. She didn't need to wait around for someone else to hand her stardom. She could write her own way into the business. And she kept doing exactly that, quietly building a reputation among Nashville insiders as a songwriter with real instincts, long before most of the country even knew her name. Still, writing hits for other people wasn't the whole dream. In 1967, everything shifted when she was brought on as the new female vocalist for the Porter Wagoner Show, one of the most watched country programs on American television at the time, replacing a singer named Norma Jean. Porter Wagoner was already a massive star, and suddenly Dolly had a national platform she'd never had before. She wasn't universally embraced right away. Her big hair, bold outfits, and larger-than-life personality were a lot for some traditional country fans to take in at first. Some longtime viewers of the show wondered openly whether this loud, glamorous newcomer belonged anywhere near Porter Wagoner's stage. But audiences came around fast, and the duets between Dolly and Porter, including songs like The Last Thing on My Mind, Please Don't Stop Loving Me, and Daddy Sang Bass, turned the pair into one of country music's most beloved acts. Week after week, television brought Dolly into homes across the entire country, and for the first time in her life, her voice was reaching millions instead of hundreds. The problem was that the better Dolly got, the more the world wanted Dolly on her own, without Porter standing beside her. Her solo singles, like Joshua and Coat of Many Colors, were proving she could carry a career entirely by herself. Coat of Many Colors in particular struck a nerve, a song rooted directly in her own childhood poverty, about a coat her mother had stitched together from rags and the cruelty she faced from classmates who mocked it. It wasn't just a hit. It was proof that Dolly's most powerful material came straight from the life she'd actually lived. Leaving the show that made her famous was an enormous risk. Porter had helped build her name, and their partnership had lasted years. But Dolly had decided she wasn't going to spend her career standing in someone else's spotlight, however grateful she was for it. Rather than have an uncomfortable conversation, Dolly did what she always did best. She wrote a song about it. That song was I Will Always Love You, written as her personal, heartfelt farewell to Porter Wagoner, a thank you and a goodbye rolled into one. By her own account, she sat down with him, played it for him directly, and let the song say what she couldn't quite put into plain words. It became a country hit for her in 1974. Almost 2 decades later, Whitney Houston would record her own version for the film The Bodyguard, turning Dolly's quiet goodbye letter into one of the best-selling singles of all time, a version so massive that many people to this day don't even realize it started as a simple, personal country song written to say goodbye to a mentor. Long before the world knew it as a Whitney Houston classic, though, it marked the moment Dolly Parton finally stepped fully into her own name. Leaving Porter Wagoner didn't slow her down, it launched her. Hit after hit followed, Jolene, Love Is Like a Butterfly, Here You Come Again, and Dolly cemented herself as one of the most gifted singer-songwriters the genre had ever produced. She was no longer anyone's discovery or anyone's duet partner. She was simply Dolly Parton, a name that by the late 1970s needed no introduction on either side of the country-pop divide. Then, in 1980, she jumped into a completely different arena. Alongside Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin, Dolly starred in 9 to 5, playing office worker Doralee Rhodes in a comedy about 3 women pushing back against a sexist, controlling boss. It was Dolly's first major film role, and by any measure it was a gamble. Plenty of successful singers had tried to cross into film and quietly disappeared from the big screen just as fast. Dolly's gamble paid off spectacularly. She brought warmth and comic timing that instantly made her a movie star, not just a country singer making a cameo. She also wrote and recorded the film's title track, 9 to 5, which topped both the country charts and the Billboard Hot 100, proving she could dominate pop music without losing an ounce of her Appalachian roots. It remains, decades later, one of the most recognizable working women anthems ever written. More film roles followed, including The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas with Burt Reynolds and the beloved 1989 drama Steel Magnolias, where she played Truvy Jones and introduced herself to yet another generation of fans. In Steel Magnolias especially, audiences saw a different side of her range, funny, tender, and grounded, standing shoulder to shoulder with an ensemble cast of major Hollywood actresses and holding her own completely. She kept acting and producing for decades afterward, moving comfortably between television movies, specials, and music, never content to stay in just one lane for very long. Beyond music and film, Dolly built an empire, but always on her own terms. Dollywood, her theme park in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, let her pour success back into the region that raised her while creating one of the region's biggest tourist destinations. It wasn't a vanity project she slapped her name on and walked away from. She stayed closely involved with it for the rest of her life, shaping its direction and using it to bring jobs and attention to the corner of Tennessee she never stopped calling home. And her Imagination Library, a program providing free books to children, grew from a small local idea into an international effort that eventually gifted hundreds of millions of books to kids around the world. Unlike a lot of celebrity charities that fade once the cameras look away, Dolly stayed personally invested in it for decades, treating it not as a publicity project but as one of the things she was proudest of in her entire life. By the time most performers would have been winding down, Dolly Parton was still writing, still touring, still acting, still building. She released new albums well into her 70s, dabbled in rock music with a project that paid tribute to her own eclectic taste, and kept showing up to award shows with the same energy she'd had decades earlier. And yet, for all the fame, one part of her life stayed almost entirely out of public view. Dolly's marriage was one of the most unusual in entertainment history, not because it was troubled, but because almost nobody ever saw it. She met Carl Dean on her very first day in Nashville, outside a laundromat, in a story she loved to retell for the rest of her life, joking that she was pleasantly surprised he looked her in the eye instead of somewhere else. It's a detail she brought up in interview after interview across her whole career, always with the same twinkle in her eye, as if the memory never lost its charm for her no matter how many times she told it. They married on May 30, 1966, in a small, quiet ceremony in Ringgold, Georgia, long before anyone could have predicted what Dolly's career would become. At the time, she was still an unknown singer chasing a dream with no guarantees attached to it. As her fame exploded, Carl made a decision that set their relationship apart from almost every other celebrity marriage. He wanted absolutely no part of the spotlight. He ran his own asphalt paving business and avoided red carpets, award shows, and interviews almost entirely. For years, many fans genuinely weren't sure what he looked like, and that mystery fed decades of public curiosity, and sometimes outright rumor, about whether their marriage was even real. Tabloids occasionally speculated that Carl was a fabrication, an invented husband to explain away Dolly's private life. Dolly found those stories more amusing than hurtful, and she'd usually respond with a joke rather than a defensive statement. Dolly usually met that speculation with humor rather than frustration. She explained many times that their marriage worked precisely because they didn't try to force themselves into the same mold. She loved performing, traveling, and being around people. Carl loved staying home and being left alone. Instead of pulling him into her world, she let him live in his. They chose not to have children, something Dolly said she'd once imagined differently for her life, but she found deep connection instead through her many nieces and nephews and through the countless children touched by programs like the Imagination Library. She often said that between her enormous extended family and the millions of kids she reached through her books, she never felt like anything was missing. That quiet, 6-decade partnership ended in March of 2025, when Carl Dean died at 82. Dolly announced his passing herself and asked fans for privacy while the family grieved. She described him simply as someone who had given her decades of love that words could never fully capture. For a woman who had built her whole life around performing for others, losing the one person who had never wanted the spotlight at all was a different, deeper kind of loss, and by her own admission, it changed her in ways her packed schedule couldn't fix. Friends close to her said that even months later, she would catch herself pausing mid-sentence when his name came up, something people who knew her said they'd almost never seen her do before. Of course, a private marriage next to a very public life invites a lot of gossip, and Dolly's did for decades. Her years working closely alongside Porter Wagoner led to persistent rumors of a secret romance, but no credible evidence ever supported that claim, and what actually happened is well documented. A powerful professional partnership that became complicated once Dolly needed to step out on her own, immortalized honestly in the song she wrote about leaving. Her lifelong friendship with Judy Ogle, a bond that stretched back to childhood, also became fuel for speculation over the years. Dolly consistently and firmly described Judy as simply her closest friend, and often pointed out how quick people are to assume romance whenever two women share an unusually close, lasting friendship, a pattern she found frustrating but never let define how she talked about the people she loved. Rather than fight every rumor with a press statement, Dolly typically just laughed them off and kept working, understanding that in her position, gossip was simply part of the deal. She never pretended to be a saint, either, joking openly about noticing attractive men and about temptation, but she always drew a clear line between playful honesty and the wilder stories that grew up around her over the decades. She once said, in her own way, that being married never made her blind, just faithful, and left it at that. In the end, most of what swirled around her personal life stayed exactly what it was, rumor, not fact. Which brings us to her final chapter, the one that has left fans absolutely reeling. For roughly the last 2 years of her life, Dolly had been open, in her own way, about health struggles. Grief over losing Carl had taken a visible toll, and on top of that she dealt with a string of physical setbacks, including issues connected to her kidneys and her immune system. In the fall before her death, she postponed a planned Las Vegas residency, and in the weeks that followed she reassured worried fans directly, telling them in her own words that she certainly wasn't done yet. Early in 2026, she gave an emotional update at Dollywood's season kickoff, admitting to the crowd that grief had left her feeling worn down and worn out, and that she'd been dealing with a handful of health issues she was working through carefully rather than ignoring. In mid-August of 2026, she had to cancel an appearance at Dollywood entirely, explaining that her doctors had essentially grounded her for the week due to dehydration and dizziness. Even through all of that, Dolly kept showing up, in spirit if not always in person. She kept posting updates. She kept thanking fans for their patience and their prayers. She kept talking about music she wanted to make and projects she still wanted to finish. Nothing about her tone during this stretch suggested a woman preparing to say a final goodbye. If anything, she sounded like someone stubbornly determined to outwork her own body, the same way she'd outworked poverty, industry skepticism, and every other obstacle placed in front of her since childhood. Then, on August 25, 2026, Dolly Parton died peacefully in Nashville, Tennessee, at the age of 80. Her family confirmed that her death followed a brief battle with cancer. The news was shared with the world through a video posted by her nephew and longtime head of security, Brian Seaver, and it landed like a shock, not because her health had been a total secret, but because right up until the very end, she was still talking like a woman with plans, not a woman saying farewell. That's exactly what makes her final interview so hard to watch now. In it, she spoke candidly about the health issues she'd been managing, the toll grief had taken since Carl's death, and the adjustments she was making to keep working, but nothing in her tone suggested she believed her story was about to end. She talked about future projects. She talked about new ways to keep connecting with her fans, even if the demands of a traditional stage had gotten harder to meet. She sounded, in every sense, like someone planning her next chapter, not closing the book. Watching it now, knowing what came only days later, small pauses and offhand jokes suddenly feel weighted with meaning that simply wasn't there in the moment it was filmed. And then, only days later, that next chapter simply never came. Her death arrived just 17 months after losing Carl, the man who had stood quietly beside her, out of frame, for nearly 60 years. Anyone who followed her closely could see that losing him had left a wound that never fully closed, even as she kept showing up, kept smiling for cameras, kept reassuring fans that she was fine. Tributes poured in almost instantly from fellow artists, actors, politicians, and ordinary fans who had grown up on her music, all of them circling back to the same idea, that Dolly wasn't just a singer people admired from a distance, she felt like family to millions of strangers who never met her in person. Fans gathered outside Dollywood in the days after her death, leaving flowers, notes, and rhinestone-covered tributes at the gates of the park she'd spent decades building. Musicians across genres, from country to pop to gospel, posted tributes describing how her songwriting had shaped their own careers, and radio stations across the country spent the following days playing nothing but her catalog, back to back, as if the whole country needed to sit with her voice one more time before fully accepting she was gone. In Tennessee, flags were lowered, and lawmakers spoke about her not just as an entertainer but as one of the state's defining cultural figures, someone whose name had become inseparable from the identity of the region she grew up in. Now the woman who spent 8 decades turning heartbreak into songs, poverty into empire, and rumor into laughter, has taken her final bow. She leaves behind more than 3,000 songs, a theme park that still bears her name, a library program that has reached hundreds of millions of children, and a body of work that shaped country music, pop music, and film for well over half a century. It's the kind of legacy that very few entertainers in history ever managed to build, and she built it starting from a one-room cabin with no running water. What makes her story resonate so deeply isn't just the scale of what she achieved, it's how consistent she stayed while achieving it. The same warmth people saw in her earliest television appearances was still there in her final interview, 6 decades later. The same humor she used to deflect rumors as a young singer was still there when she was joking with fans about health scares in her final months. Fame changed almost everything around her, the size of her audience, the size of her bank account, the size of her influence, but it never seemed to change who she actually was underneath all the rhinestones. Dolly Parton didn't just sing about resilience, she lived it, from a one-room cabin in the Smoky Mountains to the biggest stages, screens, and hearts in the world. Her music, her generosity, and that unmistakable voice aren't going anywhere. Somewhere, right now, a kid is opening a free book that arrived in their mailbox because of her, and a radio somewhere is playing Jolene or 9 to 5 or I Will Always Love You to someone who has no idea just how much of Dolly's own life is folded into those lyrics. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't end with an obituary. If this story moved you the way it moved us, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more, and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories behind the legends you grew up loving.